Blood soaked the Persian rug, yet her pulse barely fluttered. Vincent, Boston's most feared underboss, slammed his fist down, demanding her total obedience. "Quit that job. You work for me now." She didn't flinch. Smoothing her apron over her wide hips, she finally spoke the name that made his empire tremble. Grease, stale beer, and the sharp tang of cheap bourbon coated the air inside O'Malley's Tavern, a crumbling establishment tucked beneath the shadows of the Boston elevated tracks. Beatrice scrubbed the mahogany bar with a damp rag, her motions rhythmic, hypnotic, and utterly devoid of the exhaustion that should have plagued a woman working a 14-hour shift. She was a fat woman, carrying her heavy weight with a grounded, unmovable solidity. Her wide hips brushed against the beer taps, her thick thighs chafing slightly beneath the rough denim of her jeans, and her soft, round face was flushed from the relentless heat of the kitchen exhaust. To the patrons, drunks, dock workers, and the occasional low-level street dealer, she was just Big B, a permanent, unremarkable fixture of the dive bar. She took up space, yet she was entirely invisible. That invisibility was precisely her greatest weapon. Footsteps echoed against the scuffed linoleum, sharp and out of place. Beatrice didn't look up, but she noted the cadence. Leather soles, custom-made. 3 men, one walking slightly ahead, the other 2 trailing exactly 2 paces behind. The ambient noise of the tavern dropped several decibels. Even the drunken regulars instinctively shrank back into their vinyl booths. Vincent Carrozza had entered the building. Vincent was a man carved from cold marble and inherited violence, heir apparent to the Carrozza crime family, a syndicate that had a stranglehold on the city's shipping ports and underground casinos. He wore his power like a tailored second skin. His charcoal suit contrasted sharply with the grime of O'Malley's. He slid into a booth near the back, his dark eyes scanning the room with the casual disdain of a predator evaluating a slaughterhouse. Beatrice continued wiping the bar. She knew exactly who he was. She knew his father, Don Carmine Carrozza, suffered from a failing heart. She knew Vincent was consolidating power, ruthlessly eliminating rivals in the North End. She also knew that his right-hand man, a jittery enforcer named Paulie, owed $40,000 to a bookie operating out of an East Boston auto body shop. Beatrice knew everything, because people never watched what they said around the fat bartender who brought them their whiskey. They assumed her size equated to slowness, both physical and mental. It was a fatal societal flaw that she harvested daily. "Hey, sweetheart," Paulie snapped, snapping his fingers in Beatrice's direction. "Bring a bottle of the good stuff, not the swill you serve these animals." Beatrice slowly straightened, allowing the damp rag to drop onto the counter. She smoothed her stained apron over the deep curve of her stomach, taking a slow, deliberate breath. She grabbed a bottle of top-shelf scotch, dusty from lack of use, and 3 glasses, carrying them over to the corner booth. She moved silently, her heavy footfalls remarkably light, a ghost wrapped in layers of soft flesh. As she set the glasses down, a drunken patron, emboldened by liquid courage and oblivious to the danger of the men in the booth, stumbled backward and collided violently with Beatrice. The impact shoved her thick frame forward. Her hand slipped, and a splash of amber liquid spilled directly onto the sleeve of Vincent Carrozza's bespoke suit. The silence that fell over the bar was absolute. It was the heavy, suffocating silence that precedes a gunshot. Paulie leaped to his feet, his hand instinctively diving toward the bulge inside his jacket. "You stupid, clumsy cow," he snarled, ready to make an example of her to protect his boss's fragile ego. Beatrice didn't cower. She didn't shrink back, nor did she offer a frantic string of apologies. She simply turned her large body toward the drunk patron who had bumped her. With a swiftness that defied her massive frame, her thick hand shot out, grabbing the man by the collar of his grease-stained jacket. Using her low center of gravity and immense physical strength, she slammed the man face first into the wooden pillar beside the booth. The crack of bone on wood echoed loudly. The man slumped to the floor, groaning, his nose shattered. Beatrice turned back to the booth, pulling a clean white cloth from her apron pocket. She offered it to Vincent, her face completely passive, her dark eyes locked onto his. "The club soda is behind the bar," Beatrice said, her voice a low, smooth alto that carried no tremor of fear. "It will lift the stain before it sets." Vincent stared at her. His hand had been hovering near his own concealed weapon, but he slowly lowered it. He looked at the bleeding man on the floor, then up at the towering, heavy-set woman standing over his table. Most people pissed themselves when they made a mistake in front of him. This woman had casually neutralized the source of the problem and offered a laundry solution without blinking. "What's your name?" Vincent asked, his voice a gravelly whisper that cut through the tension. "B," she lied effortlessly. "Bear," Vincent repeated, testing the syllable on his tongue. His eyes dragged over her unkempt hair, the sweat on her brow, the undeniable girth of her waistline, and the absolute, terrifying coldness in her eyes. It was a look he recognized. It was the look of a killer in a slaughter line. "You shouldn't be pouring drinks in a dump like this." "It pays the rent," Beatrice replied flatly, turning on her heel. Her wide hips swayed slightly as she walked back to the bar, leaving the underboss of the Boston Mafia staring at her back. Vincent didn't drink the scotch. He watched her for the next hour. He watched how she commanded her space, how the men in the bar unconsciously yielded the right of way when she walked past. She wasn't just a bartender. She was a warden overseeing a cell block, disguised beneath layers of fat and a stained apron. By the time Vincent stood up to leave, throwing a crisp $100 bill onto the table, a dangerous obsession had taken root in his mind. He needed someone with that exact breed of ice in their veins. Rain lashed against the cracked brickwork of the alleyway behind O'Malley's, turning the discarded cardboard boxes into grey mush. Beatrice pushed the heavy steel exit door open, the hinges screaming in protest. The icy downpour instantly soaked through her thin cotton coat, clinging to the deep curves of her body. She pulled her collar up, her heavy boots splashing into a puddle, eager to walk the 6 blocks to her dilapidated apartment. A sleek black town car blocked the exit of the alley. The headlights cut through the torrential rain, blinding her for a fraction of a second. Beatrice stopped. She didn't panic. She merely adjusted her stance, widening her thick legs to ground herself on the slippery cobblestone. She slipped her right hand into her deep coat pocket, her fingers wrapping around the cold, textured grip of the Smith & Wesson snub-nose revolver she always carried. The rear door of the car opened. An umbrella bloomed into the night, held by Paulie, who rushed to cover the man, stepping out into the storm. Vincent Carrozza walked forward, stopping just 5 feet from where Beatrice stood. The rain hammered against the umbrella above him, but Beatrice stood fully exposed to the elements, her wet hair plastered to her cheeks, water streaming down her double chin. "You work late, B," Vincent said, the glow of his cigarette burning a fiery red hole in the dark alley. The floors don't mop themselves, Mr. Carrozza, she replied calmly. Vincent's eyebrows twitched. You know who I am? Everyone knows who you are. You're not exactly subtle, Beatrice stated, rain dripping from her eyelashes. She didn't break eye contact. Her thumb clicked the safety off the revolver inside her pocket. Vincent chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. He stepped closer, invading her personal space. He was a tall man, but Beatrice was a mountain of a woman, and she didn't yield an inch. The sheer mass of her body was an intimidating barrier, and for the first time in his life, Vincent found himself confronted by a woman who didn't try to use sex appeal or fragile innocence to manipulate him. She simply existed, solid and dangerous. I need people who don't flinch, Vincent said, his voice lowering to a deadly octave. My father's organization is bleeding. We have rats in the shipping yards and accountants who think they can skim off the top. I need a shadow. Someone invisible who can watch the floor, collect the debts, and crack a skull without hesitating. Someone no one expects. Beatrice let out a weary sigh, shifting her weight. I serve cheap beer to dock workers. I'm not a leg breaker for the mob. I saw what you did in there today, Vincent countered, gesturing toward the tavern wall. That wasn't fear. That was training. You shattered a man's face, and your heart rate didn't even spike. I looked into you. Beatrice Gallagher. No tax records past 5 years. No family. No footprint. It's like you sprouted out of the concrete. I like my privacy. Vincent took a final step, stopping merely inches from her chest. He tilted the umbrella so it covered them both, plunging them into an intimate, dry cocoon amidst the raging storm. I don't care about your past. I care about your utility. I'm giving you a way out of this squalor. He reached into his coat and pulled out a thick envelope of cash, pressing it against her damp chest. Quit that job. You work for me now. It wasn't a request. It was an imperial command from a man who had ordered men buried in the foundations of high-rises for less defiance. Beatrice looked down at the envelope, then back up at Vincent's sharp, arrogant face. A slow, dark smile crept across her lips, transforming her soft features into something feral and terrifying. She didn't take the money. Instead, she pushed her heavy chest forward, forcing Vincent to take a half step back to maintain his balance. You think you can buy me with pocket change and threats, Beatrice whispered, her voice dropping into a register that made the hair on the back of Vincent's neck stand up. You think you're a king because your sick father lets you play with his guns? Paulie lunged forward with a curse, reaching for his weapon. But Vincent threw a hand back, stopping his enforcer. Vincent stared at Beatrice, genuine shock fracturing his composed exterior. Who the hell do you think you're talking to? I know exactly who I'm talking to, Beatrice said, stepping out from under his umbrella, embracing the freezing rain. She squared her massive shoulders. I'm talking to the son of the man who slaughtered 14 people at the State Street warehouse 15 years ago. The man who thought he wiped out his only real competition in this city. Vincent's blood turned to ice. The State Street massacre. It was the night his father had annihilated the leadership of their fiercest rivals. It was a closely guarded secret, a myth whispered only by the oldest bosses in the back rooms of private clubs. Who are you? Vincent demanded, his voice suddenly stripped of its arrogant drawl, replaced by raw, pulsing adrenaline. Beatrice wiped the rainwater from her jaw, her dark eyes flashing with a vengeance that had been simmering in the deep fat and marrow of her bones for a decade and a half. She pulled her hand from her pocket, keeping the gun concealed but letting him see the heavy gold ring on her pinky finger. A ring bearing a crest that had been presumed burned to ashes. "My name isn't Beatrice Gallagher," she said, her voice cutting through the roar of the Boston storm like a sharpened guillotine blade. "My name is Beatrice Lombardi, daughter of Don Salvatore Lombardi. And I didn't survive that warehouse just to become your errand girl, Vincent. I survived to take back my city." Vincent stared at the massive, imposing woman before him. The ghost of the Lombardi syndicate wasn't a heavily armed crew or an undercover federal agent. It was the fat bartender sweeping up peanut shells, hiding in plain sight, waiting for the perfect moment to wrap her thick hands around his empire's throat. And in his arrogance, he had just invited her through the front door. Rainwater pooled at their feet, mingling with the grime of the Boston alleyway, as the weight of Beatrice's revelation settled over them like a concrete shroud. Vincent stood completely paralyzed. For a man who had orchestrated the hostile takeovers of entire syndicates, being caught off guard was a foreign, deeply unsettling sensation. The Lombardi name was a ghost story used to terrify disloyal soldiers in the Carrozza family. 15 years ago, Don Salvatore Lombardi had been massacred along with his inner circle. No one had survived. Yet standing before him, a mountain of flesh, fury, and unyielding strength, was the living embodiment of his family's greatest sin. Paulie's gun trembled in the freezing downpour. "Boss," the enforcer stammered, panic lacing his rough voice. "She's a Lombardi. I should put a bullet in her brain right now." "Lower the weapon, Paulie," Vincent ordered, his voice dangerously soft. His dark eyes never left Beatrice's face. He was captivated. Where a lesser man would see a threat to be instantly eliminated, Vincent saw an unprecedented opportunity. His father's organization was crumbling because the old men at the top respected bloodlines and history more than raw ambition. Vincent needed leverage. Beatrice, with her heavy, imposing frame and a name that carried mythical weight, was the ultimate trump card. "You lower that gun, Paulie, or I will break your arm in 3 places before you can pull the trigger," Beatrice stated, her tone utterly devoid of bluff. She stood her ground, her wide hips planted firmly, her heavy breasts rising and falling with slow, controlled breaths. She did not look like a mob princess. She looked like a woman who had spent 15 years absorbing the brutal realities of the world and turning them into armor. The fat on her bones was not a weakness, it was a fortress. Vincent finally stepped back, signaling for Paulie to retreat. "You want your city back, Beatrice? You can't do it serving cheap whiskey in a dive bar. You have the name, but I have the men, the guns, and the infrastructure." He gestured toward his waiting car. "Get in. We have a war to plan." Beatrice hesitated for only a fraction of a second. She had waited a decade and a half for this exact invitation into the belly of the beast. Slipping her revolver back into her deep coat pocket, she walked past Vincent, her large body brushing against his tailored suit, unapologetically taking up the space she deserved. The scent of her, soap, rain, and raw iron, wrapped around him, igniting a strange, dark thrill in his chest. An hour later, they sat in the sprawling, glass-walled living room of Vincent's penthouse overlooking the glittering Boston skyline. Beatrice had refused a change of clothes, choosing to remain in her damp jeans and stained shirt. She sat on the edge of a white leather sofa, her thick thighs spread slightly to accommodate her large stomach, exuding a raw, working-class dominance that made the luxurious surroundings look fragile. Vincent poured 2 glasses of scotch, handing one to her. "My father, Carmine, is dying, but he refuses to pass the torch. Worse, he's letting the Irish syndicates run wild in the South End because he's too weak to fight. The cuffs are getting restless. If I move against him, half the family will view it as a betrayal. But if I bring them a Lombardi, if I tell them that the Carrozza and Lombardi families are uniting to restore the old ways, they will follow us blindly." Beatrice took a slow sip of the amber liquid. "You want a marriage of convenience, a political alliance to legitimize your coup." "I want a queen," Vincent corrected, sitting in the armchair opposite her, his gaze dragging over her thick neck, her double chin, and the sharp, calculating intelligence in her eyes. He was intoxicatingly drawn to her solidity. The women he usually entertained were waifish, fragile things who agreed with his every word. Beatrice looked like she could crush him, both physically and intellectually, and the realization sent a jolt of heat straight to his core. "I need someone who understands power, someone who doesn't flinch. If I agree to this," Beatrice rumbled, leaning forward, her massive presence dominating the space between them. "I am not your puppet, Vincent. I don't stand quietly in the background. I sit at the table. I review the ledgers. I give the orders alongside you. And when your father is dethroned, the men who pulled the triggers at the State Street warehouse belong to me." "Agreed," Vincent said without hesitation. He extended his hand. Beatrice looked at his manicured fingers, then reached out with her own large, calloused hand. Her grip was like a vice, crushing and absolute. As their skin met, the air in the penthouse seemed to crackle. It was a pact sealed in blood, ambition, and an undeniable, dangerous chemistry. The real test came 3 nights later at the underground dining room of a high-end Italian restaurant in the North End, where Vincent had summoned his father's most loyal capos, Leonard, Arthur, and Gregory. The 3 older men were notoriously stubborn, traditionalists who viewed Vincent as an arrogant upstart. They sat around the mahogany table, smoking cigars and exchanging resentful whispers. When the heavy oak doors swung open, the room fell dead silent. Vincent walked in first, but it was the woman beside him who sucked the oxygen from the room. Beatrice wore a custom-tailored, deep crimson blazer that hugged her broad shoulders and draped over her wide hips, paired with wide-leg black trousers that emphasized her commanding height and heavy build. She moved with the deliberate, unstoppable force of a glacier. Her dark hair was slicked back, revealing the Lombardi crest ring gleaming on her thick finger. "Gentlemen," Vincent announced, his voice echoing off the brick walls, "allow me to introduce my partner, Beatrice Lombardi, the surviving heir of Don Salvatore." Arthur dropped his cigar onto the tablecloth. Leonard turned a sickening shade of grey. Beatrice did not wait for an invitation. She walked to the head of the table, pulling out the heaviest chair, and sat down with a thud that rattled the silverware. She rested her thick, powerful arms on the table, surveying the terrified men before her. 15 years ago, you thought you buried my family," Beatrice said, her voice a low, terrifying rumble that commanded absolute submission. "You were wrong. I am here to collect what is mine. You will pledge your loyalty to Vincent and myself tonight, or you will not leave this room breathing." Vincent watched her, his heart hammering against his ribs. She was magnificent. a terrifying, beautiful goddess of vengeance, cloaked in soft, heavy flesh. As the Kapos scrambled to bow their heads and swear their allegiance to the new regime, Vincent knew he had made the greatest deal of his life. He hadn't just secured his empire. He had found a woman who was entirely his equal. Tension hummed through the damp, salty air of the Boston naval shipyards. The alliance between Vincent and Beatrice had taken the underworld by storm, bringing the fragmented factions of the Carrozza Empire to heel with terrifying efficiency. The fat bartender from O'Malley's was now the most feared woman on the eastern seaboard. But absolute power never comes without a price, and the dying king was not ready to relinquish his crown. Carmine Carrozza had finally discovered the truth. Enraged by his son's betrayal and terrified of the Lombardy resurrection, the frail Don had arranged a parley at Pier 47, ostensibly to bless their union and formally step down. It was, of course, a trap. Midnight fog rolled off the harbor as Vincent's armored SUV came to a halt in front of an abandoned cargo warehouse. The rusted corrugated metal groaned in the wind. Vincent adjusted his jacket, his jaw tight. Beside him, Beatrice sat in stoic silence, dressed in a heavy black trench coat that enveloped her massive frame. She looked immovable, a pillar of dark confidence. "My father is a desperate man," Vincent murmured, checking the magazine of his pistol. "He has Arthur and Gregory with him. They swore loyalty to us, but old habits die hard." "They will die tonight," Beatrice stated flatly, her deep voice vibrating through the confined space of the vehicle. She turned her large, soft face toward Vincent. Over the past month, their tactical alliance had morphed into a dark, consuming romance. They had spent long nights poring over maps, sharing whiskey, and exploring the intense, primal attraction between them. Vincent worshipped her strength, tracing the deep curves of her stomach and the heavy flesh of her thighs with a reverence he had never shown another human being. She was his gravity. "Are you ready?" Vincent asked, his hand reaching out to squeeze her thick knee. "I have been for 15 years, Beatrice replied. They stepped out into the freezing fog, flanked by Paulie and 2 other loyal soldiers. The massive warehouse doors were already open, revealing a cavernous space lit by flickering industrial halogen lights. At the far end, surrounded by a dozen heavily armed men, sat Carmine in a leather wheelchair. "Vincent!" Carmine's voice was a wet, rattling cough. "You bring a Lombardy dog to my feet? You spit on our family name for a fat, common whore." Before Vincent could raise his weapon in blind rage at the insult, the heavy steel cargo doors behind Carmine's men violently slammed shut. The echo was deafening. Carmine's soldiers spun around in panic. Beatrice stepped forward, her heavy boots cracking against the concrete. She didn't draw her weapon. She simply raised her right hand, adorned with her father's gold ring. Suddenly, from the catwalks high above, from the shadows of the shipping crates, and from the ventilation shafts, dozens of figures emerged. They were not mafia soldiers in tailored suits. They were dock workers, mechanics, waitresses, and janitors. The invisible, working-class backbone of Boston. The people Beatrice had served drinks to, the people who had told her their secrets, the people who owed their livelihoods and loyalties to the fat bartender who had quietly bailed them out of debt and protected them from loan sharks over the past decade. She hadn't just inherited a mob family. She had built an army of ghosts. Every single one of them was holding a shotgun, a rifle, or a heavy wrench, all aimed directly at Carmine and his men. "You always underestimated the people who clean up your messes, Carmine," Beatrice boomed, her voice projecting with massive theatrical authority. "You thought power was inherited. Power is earned in the dirt." Panic erupted. Arthur raised his submachine gun to fire at Beatrice, but before he could squeeze the trigger, Vincent moved with blinding speed. He stepped in front of Beatrice, firing 2 precise shots into Arthur's chest. At the exact same moment, Beatrice's hidden army opened fire. The warehouse turned into a slaughterhouse of smoke, blood, and shattered concrete. Beatrice grabbed Vincent by the shoulder, using her immense physical mass and low center of gravity to pull him behind a stack of steel shipping containers as bullets ricocheted around them. She pressed her heavy body against his, her chest heaving, her eyes wild with adrenaline. Vincent looked up at her, breathing heavily, completely overwhelmed by the chaos she had orchestrated. She was a tactical genius. "I told you I wasn't just your errand girl," she yelled over the deafening gunfire, a feral grin splitting her face. "You are a goddamn masterpiece," Vincent roared back, grabbing the thick collar of her trench coat and pulling her face down to his. He kissed her violently, bruising her lips, tasting gunpowder, rain, and absolute victory. Beatrice kissed him back, her heavy hands gripping his face, claiming him just as surely as she was claiming the city. The gunfire ceased within 3 minutes. Carmine's loyalists were dead on the floor. The dying Don sat in his wheelchair, coughing blood, abandoned by his men. Beatrice and Vincent stepped out from behind the crates, walking side by side toward the old man. Beatrice pulled the snub-nose revolver from her pocket. She looked down at the man who had murdered her father. There was no hesitation, no dramatic monologue. She simply raised the gun, leveled it at Carmine's head, and pulled the trigger. The echo of the gunshot faded into the foggy Boston night. Vincent looked at the throne that was now officially his, and then he looked at the massive, terrifying, beautiful woman standing beside him. He dropped to one knee, ignoring the blood soaking into his suit pants, and took her heavy, calloused hand, kissing the Lombardy ring, and then the soft skin of her knuckles. He wasn't just pledging his love, he was swearing fealty. "My queen," Vincent whispered. Beatrice smiled, pulling him up into her powerful embrace. The city belonged to the invisible woman, and the underworld would never be the same. Did this epic conclusion leave you absolutely speechless? Beatrice proved that true power doesn't come from fitting into society's fragile molds, but from commanding every inch of your space. If you loved this dark mafia romance and the ultimate plot twist, smash that like button right now. Share this video with friends who crave intense drama, and don't forget to subscribe for more thrilling, unpredictable stories. Leave a comment below. What was your favorite moment of Beatrice's revenge?